one of the things that we started, we've tried to develop and improve our lighting over the years, and ILM's always had a really rich history with creatures. Davy Jones is obviously a really beautiful example of what ILM's been able to do with creatures in the past. What's happening, of course, is, studios are all faced with a situation where we have ever shortening schedules. And so we want to try and maintain the quality of the work, but in the shorter time frame, we want it to be faster for artists to work and get down to the creative nitty-gritty faster rather than having to deal with a lot of technical issues. And so one of the things we started talking about a few years ago was creating an energy-conserving shader set that really behaved more physically correctly, more like in the real world. And we started actually playing with this talking about it a little bit towards the end of Iron Man 1, and then implemented a system on Terminator Salvation. And then I was able to use that extensively on Iron Man 2. So during the period on Iron Man 2, the system really became mature, and it essentially became the standard that we use across all films at ILM right now. But we hadn't really used it much in creature work. We'd used it for things like robots and metallic surfaces, and it really gave us a big boost there. It works really well with things like environments where you're outdoors, it's sunny, there's a lot of interesting stuff reflected in the environment. On Terminator, we'd been able to exploit the fact that in an artificial environment like the factory in Terminator, it gave you a lot of control to make you mirror what's going on in the real world. And that was more like the situation we were faced with Pirates. What we hadn't done so much was really play with a lot of the creature work on Pirates. And what was interesting was we were faced with a magical creature, the mermaid, that didn't necessarily want to respond completely physically. You wanted a certain sense of magic to it. Although what was interesting was as Rob Marshall decided to, really make them more and more realistic and keep the human aspects more and not have them transform so much. And he actually also sort of reined back a little bit on how flashy they were and that sort of thing. Then the physical basis of the materials was really useful there. But, I have to say that I felt that on Pirates, we didn't quite get the optimizations of lighting that we'd experienced on Iron Man 2. The creatures were different. We did find we had to tweak things more in the different environments. But I think we realized that part of the reason for that was the way that we had to engineer the materials so that we got all those beautiful scaly anisotropic reflections, really, that made them so pretty, that was sort of a cheat in a way. And so that, then you put that into your physically based lighting system, and it doesn't necessarily work as easily out of the box as it would with something that's a really physically correct material. So it was a bit of a lesson. Yeah, well, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Times was a challenge because we had a short schedule, and the studio really wanted to do the film in 3D. And so we'd actually luckily just had the experience on the Star Tours ride and on Avatar, the chunk of shots that ILM did on Avatar, of setting up a stereo pipeline that was actually pretty robust when we got into it. A lot of the compositing tools were really well thought out. On Pirates of the Caribbean, we were using footage shot with the RED cameras. It was the first time we'd used that at ILM. And we were actually able to benefit from a really good relationship with RED, where they were very cooperative with us, sent us up a camera. We did a bunch of color tests and evaluations and looked at ways that we could make the RED footage look more like film and all this sort of stuff. So we had a lot of help or encouragement on the technical side, and our team at ILM came up with some interesting ways to convert their data that I think actually helped the project. So we were dealing with the digital pipeline and we were dealing with the 3D pipeline, and the issues for us were you've got a bunch of mermaids splashing around in water. It's really quite challenging to track in their splashes. So we ended up going with a lot more computer-generated splashes, perhaps. And in addition, we went and filmed stereo splashes as well, a separate thing, so that we would have that material to composite in. But that was where the stereo actually got complicated, because I have to say one thing that really benefited us on the film in terms of stereo was that the decision was made early on, mostly at the suggestion of the stereographer and with our complete enthusiastic support, to shoot the project in as near parallel as we could, more like an animated film. Stereo films that have been made up till this point tend to use a rig which has a convergence where the camera actually angles in and focuses on something. The disadvantage of that is that means that you have to really decide where you want the convergence while you're making the film, and it also actually has complicated things like match animation, match moving cameras, and rotoscoping a little bit. So even though we didn't necessarily get a huge it didn't make it easy or anything, shooting stereo. What we found was, compared to other films that were doing 3D at the time at the company, we actually ran into a lot less headaches because of taking this parallel approach. What it meant was that you use the ability of the camera, the red camera, to shoot an oversized image, and we actually crop into that image, and that's how we have flexibility to adjust convergence. So we're throwing away 100 pixels either side of the frame, but it does give us flexibility, and it did seem to make it smoother in terms of the things that we thought would be hard on the stereo. Working in stereo, you have to be a lot more careful in layout and animation. People get used to cheating, although of course we always try and beat that out of people, because if you're doing any sort of physically based simulation, like a particle simulation or a water splash, the 3D space is important anyway because of the way the character interacts with the physics of the simulation. So we had situations on Pirates of the Caribbean where we were match animating a body to a mermaid, and it just wasn't working, and we discovered that the head of the mermaid was actually 2 feet behind her shoulders somehow, and it was some cheat that had happened in the layout phase. And the problem is that sometimes you really have to be on top of your quality control, because if it makes it into the pipeline, what sometimes happens is that the next artist comes along and says, well, it looks like it's working, so I can just, band-aid this on top of it. And it actually goes quite far down the pipeline, and you're like, oh, this just isn't quite working. And you open up the scene, you're like, oh my God, her head's 2 feet off the body, And so then you have to go back and you redo the work. So we had to really be on top of that and work with the artists and sort of say, okay, you've got to quality control that. Everything has to be proper, in proper space. Animators can't animate to cameras as much. So it does make a big difference with that. I mean, generally our rule of thumb was that lighting wouldn't change a whole lot. Animation, we didn't think would change a whole lot, although the issue that I mentioned does add the fact that they have to be much more, they can't cheat as much. Layout, definitely it added, and rotoscoping it added. Compositing, where it really got more complicated was when you're doing things like you've got a water surface which is uneven and it's going back in stereo space, and you're adding 3 mermaids splashing around, and each of them have splashes, and you somehow have to make it look like those splashes are sitting on this uneven water surface. That created a lot of nightmares for people. What oddly didn't create nightmares was one of the issues that you get when you're shooting, as we did, with a mirror system where one camera is looking down at a mirror and one shooting through a mirror. You get these, and even just the fact that the eyes are offset, you get different reflections in different eyes. The polarizing filter and the mirror has an effect on things. And so there'd be shots of the mermaid coming up in a pool, for example, a little sea pool, and you'd get reflections in one eye but not in the other. And that's something that actually we even experience in real life, and it's certainly common in stereo photography, and the tendency is to want to fix some of that stuff. But we found that when we started trying to paint out reflections that were in one eye and weren't in the other, the water stopped looking wet. So you actually want to leave in some of these imperfections, and so it's definitely, we learn a lot, put it that way. So it was a fun experience for that.